Appreciate you joining us today. Presenting today is going to be Becky Harwick. Becky, do you want to give a wave so everybody knows who you are? That's Becky. You'll see her because she's going to be the one talking. Becky put together this presentation, Vegetable Gardening in Small Spaces, for part of our Master Gardener Library series that we did at the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library. So she's presented it once earlier this year on that platform. With everything that's happening with COVID-19, we had to cease all of our face-to-face meetings and programs. And so this is one in a series of webinars that we are really excited to host for you as Shawnee County Extension Master Gardeners and staff. So I am going to let Becky get started. The way that we'd like to do this, just for everybody's ease and enjoyment, internet connectivity has been an issue. So while Becky's presenting, if everybody could mute their microphones and stop their cameras while she's presenting. If you have questions, and you could put them in the chat box that's most likely at the bottom or the top of your screen, I will be reading questions as she's going, and she'll take a couple breaks and we'll answer all those questions. Then at the end, we can all get on and she can minimize her presentation and we can all see each other's faces and have a nice chat about vegetable gardening at that time for whoever wants to join us. So I will go ahead and mute myself and stop my camera. I'll keep an eye on that chat box and just let us know if you have questions. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Ariel. Yeah, we're going to talk about vegetable gardening in small spaces. And, you know, for a lot of people like me that live in town, I love to grow vegetables, but I don't really have a large garden. So vegetable gardening in small spaces is particularly of interest to me. I've had a garden in all the places I've lived, in Boise, in Seattle. In Seattle, it's kind of tough because the sunlight up there, so I had a raised bed built by my fence and along my driveway where it would catch the most sun. And then here, I've got a great little place out by my garden shed. So it's always been fun for me and very satisfying. So we're going to get started. This screen is one, you know, that we're associated with Kansas State University, and of course K-State is an affirmative action equal opportunity employer, and the language on there I think probably everyone is familiar with, but they do not discriminate with regard to all of those different categories that are on there. So why grow vegetables? Well, one reason is because they're fresher than store-bought and they taste good. They also help you make healthy choices for your diet. It's a great way to teach kids about gardening and to encourage them to eat veggies. And in fact, when I did the presentation at the library, I was really gratified to see that two families had brought their kids there to listen to this, and they had some good questions, and they were building small gardens for their kids for this year. And of course, vegetable gardening is fun, and it's a colorful addition to your garden. And it gives you a great sense of accomplishment. You know, you can just go ahead and brag about it to your friends and neighbors and give them all of the zucchini squash that you've got and all of those kinds of things. But on a serious note, you know, this year, and particularly in the situation that we are in, I think all of us that are gardeners find that gardening is so therapeutic, and growing vegetables that, you know, you go out and you see how they're doing, you see what you've got, you know, rip the weeds out, you know, all of those kinds of things is good for our heads, and it's good for us to get outside. And then another reason, particularly this year, but always, there are going to be so many people that are food insecure throughout, you know, the rest of this year and who knows how long. And so as you're growing vegetables this year, plant extra and be prepared to give them away to whoever needs them, seniors, single moms, you know, whoever needs them. So I think this is going to be one year that we can get a lot of satisfaction out of it. All right, let's talk a little bit about traditional vegetable gardens. You think of them as large rectangular plots. They're planted in long rows, usually take a lot of water, requires weeding and weeding and weeding. And so let's explore some of the alternatives for those smaller spaces. Alternative types of gardens. We think of raised beds, square foot gardening. How about going vertical? we'll talk about each of these: interplanting, succession planting, and then of course container gardening. So let's start off with talking a little bit about raised beds. Why raised beds? They produce 1.5 to 2 times more produce. They have better drainage, less soil compaction, and it's a more efficient use for water and fertilizer. And these are pretty nice ones. I've looked at these. I wish I had the room to put in more of those. But the soil is easier to amend in a confined area, and this is particularly helpful where clay soil is a problem. And I'm thinking Kansas, there's not much of any place that clay soil isn't a problem. So making a raised bed, the bed is above the clay and it's filled with an appropriate mix. It helps not only with season extension, but with general crop health by contributing to good drainage and soil aeration for healthy root growth. And then the thing that's fun about it is, you know, you can make them permanent if you've got a great place. Or if you decide you don't want a bed where it is, you can set them up and use them annually and move them around or make changes to them. So it's kind of fun. I'm going to make some changes to mine this year. And so by doing this presentation, I learned a few things and saw some things that I'm interested in. Now, raised beds can also warm up more rapidly in the spring, and it helps produce to get an earlier start. But on the flip side of that, they may also cool off more rapidly when the weather gets cool. So your plants may need some kind of protection. I think here we're probably okay. We have a fairly long growing season and can put in different kinds of plants. So unless we have some real weird weather, which we can, the cooler, we may not need to do much protection in the fall. And then one of the things that's really nice about raised beds, they have easier access because the beds are generally higher up off the ground, and plants are easier to reach because of the smaller area. So, for people that have a little bit of trouble getting down, and my knees are getting there, but, raising them up a little bit, kids can reach in there, and for people that even have more access issues, you can make the bed even higher so that if they were wheelchair bound or, used a walker or something like that, it's easier for them to reach out there and still enjoy having a gardening space. Here are some examples of raised beds. A pretty good use of some cinder blocks and bricks. On the right lower corner, this is one where the soil's down a little bit, and they've got some black plastic in there, so the plants are a little bit more protected. Might be good to use when it's a little bit cooler. Now, the one in the upper right hand side, I looked at that and at first I thought, well, that's really cool. And then I got to looking at it and I thought, how in the heck would you ever reach the plants that are in that middle section without having to step in the other sections, which you don't really want to do. So I'm thinking about doing mine, raising it up another layer, but I think if I were to follow this one, I would move that top layer over to one side where it would be, easier to reach and get around and everything. But there are some, get you thinking about what you might want to do. Now, square foot gardening is another type of gardening in raised beds. It was introduced to the world back in the 1980s. Mel Bartholomew's book, Square Foot Gardening. In fact, I remember when there was a program on TV that was square foot gardening. And so he was actually an engineer and really got interested in gardening. And so then threw some of his engineering mentality in there and came up with square foot gardening. He also started the Square Foot Gardening Foundation in 1996 with a mission to help world hunger end 1 square foot at a time. And so again, looking at what's going on, we may revert back to that and start, planting square feet of gardens so we can hand out and help our neighbors. It uses a very simple concept. You just divide the garden area into square foot sections to plant. And so he uses square or rectangular shaped raised beds breaks them down into a smaller 1-foot square area, and lays a grid out over the top of the garden as a visual indicator. So if you wanted to do that, I mean, you can do the dividing by using, wood or plastic pipes or whatever it is that would work well for you to set it up in 1-foot squares. The beds themselves, like all raised beds, should be at least 6 to 12 inches deep. And I would think on the little higher side, 6 inches is probably pretty shallow. So then from there, with square foot gardening, the number of plants in each square depends on the size of the vegetable being planted. The garden must be small enough that you can reach into it so you never walk on the dirt. And I say dirt, I should say medium, because Mel Bartholomew recommended using a mixture of 1 part peat moss, 1 part mixed compost, 1 part vermiculite. He said that it helped to reduce weeds and keep the soil nutrient rich and moist. And it's also drains very easily, which is one of the things that you want to do in a raised bed. So let's talk a little bit about the soil for raised beds. Several types of amended soil mixes can be used, but again, I'm using soil sort of loosely there. But usually you can mix some good topsoil and then organic matter in similar portions. Some of you may make your own compact post, and so those kinds of things work well. And so it's kind of a thing where what's your other soil like, and what's your compost like. When I built mine here, I dug out the bottom because I have clay soil, and dug it down and mixed the bagged planting medium with it, and then dumped other bags of that on top of it. But again, mine's not very big, so it's easier for me to buy the bagged stuff. And if you look on the, whatever kind of bagged medium there is out at the big box stores or wherever you buy it, you can see that it's really similar to what he recommends, because it doesn't really have a lot of, regular, what you think of regular dirt. It's all got a mostly organic matter in it. And so organic matter can be cotton burr compost, composted manure, composted yard waste, and sphagnum peat moss. So, any of those things are going to work. Now, when you're building a raised bed, when you're incorporating the soil mix, several guidelines should be followed. You want to dig down in that existing soil that's in the bottom, assuming that you've kind of scooped the soil out and kept some of that, and spade or till 6 to 8 inches deep. And then down at the bottom where you're going into the existing soil, you want to blend some of the amended mix that you're putting in there into that existing soil. Incorporate about 2 inches of mix into the upper few inches of existing soil. And this will help avoid the problems from having 2 different soil layers. Your plants will not run into a dead end. They'll have a little bit more to work with if you combine that. And then you can go ahead and fill, the rest of the bed with the good soil mix or good amended medium. And so the result will be about 10 to 12 inches of rich soil for plants to grow in. Now, watering raised beds is really, pretty easy, because you water when the soil dries out slightly. 1 or more inches of water per week is the general recommendation. And truly, drip irrigation, if you want to set that up, is ideal for raised beds, because drip irrigation uses less water and is more efficient. The tubing or a soaker hose is laid out over the bed, spaced according to the soil type and plants. So again, because you're talking about a smaller area, it's easier to develop some of these drip irrigation systems or the soaker hose, and you can, depending on how you plant your garden, you can change it around if you need to, and move those things more easily in a smaller area. But drip irrigation places the water at the root system. And so the drip tubing can also be buried below the soil surface for the most efficient delivery method. So that would be by far the best, but some of us really don't want to do that. And depending again on the size of your garden and how much time you want to spend out there, why hand watering is what I use because mine's smaller. And so, it's therapeutic for me to go out there and see how my garden's doing and, water the plants. You can place the water at the base of the plants where it needs to be. You can stick your finger in the soil and see, how damp it is and all of those kinds of things. I would not recommend using a sprinkler. I think you need to be very careful with that because consistently wetting the foliage of vegetable plants can encourage disease problems. And last year was a good example of, having disease problems because we had such a wet, humid year. And so, the foliage had struggles anyway with fungus and, mildew and those kinds of things. And so adding more water from a sprinkler would only exacerbate those problems. So if you do use a sprinkler, water in the morning so the foliage can dry before nightfall, and you also lose less water to evaporation. As far as fertilizing raised beds, the fertilization needs of a raised bed garden are the same as a traditional garden. Before planting in the spring, the general application of about 1 pound of 10-10-10 fertilizer can be spread over 100 square foot of bed and incorporated. And then throughout the year, you can side dress the crops during the growing season based on the needs of the individual crops. Do not over fertilize, as this will lead to poor production. Now, as I said that, I again use bagged medium. And so if you're using that and you're using like a gardening soil for vegetables, make sure that you read the label because most of those already have fertilizer in them. And so if you were to go out and dump several bags on your garden and incorporate that in, and then add more fertilizer on top of that, you would probably be over fertilized. So again, I would suggest, well, read the label in any case on whatever you're buying for your garden. But in this case, if you're putting together one for the first time particularly, and you're not using some of the medium that you've already prepared at home, be sure you read that label because you don't want to over fertilize it. So Ariel, questions?
We don't have any questions right now.
Okay. We will continue on. Let's talk a little bit about going vertical in your small garden. And there's lots of benefits of going up. You can grow more food in less space, and particularly with vining crops take up less space rather than sprawling on the ground. Zucchini squash, cucumbers, even some of the things like cantaloupe, which is not a vegetable, but if you raise cantaloupe, you could grow that vertically. The only thing is if your fruit gets very big, it may get too heavy and you may have to figure out a sling or something for it to keep it from falling on the ground. But those vining crops, and it's easier, it's easier to keep them up away from the bugs that live on the ground. And then it's easier to harvest. It brings the crops to eye level and makes finding them easier. And if you're like me, and especially if you do grow things like cucumbers and zucchinis, one day you go out there and you look at them and they're these tiny little things, and it seems like the very next day you go out there and they're huge. And so I think going vertical helps you, keep an eye on them, keeps track of where they are. And so you don't go out there and have a monster vegetable that got away from you. It also makes for cleaner, prettier vegetables, and they don't have the spots or dirt from laying on the ground. So that's a benefit, especially if you're, thinking about exhibiting them. And then easier maintenance. It's easier to get to the roots with water and fertilizer. And again, it helps you know how much water you're putting on them, and it's easier for putting the fertilizer down around the roots where it belongs. And then the other thing is more sun exposure. it's less likely to get shaded out by other crops. Structures for vertical gardening, I mean, the options are almost endless there. Just, use your imagination. For more permanent structures, you can think a trellis, an arbor, a pergola. For less permanent fixtures, think about teepees like this one, and that's something that I had not even thought about until I was looking for things to put into this presentation. You can make cages out of wire and bend that around. And then lattice panels, and this is something that I've utilized on the backside of my garden. It's kind of a little ways out from my garden shed. And so I built a framework that fits against my garden shed, and then went to one of the big box stores and got several of those white plastic lattice panels and fixed them onto the framework that I built out from my garden shed. And so it works perfectly because, I can leave them out there in the winter. I've nailed them on, so I can leave them out there in the winter. You can hose them off, and the plants just love them. So that's what I have used. But you can be creative and just let your imagination be your guide. Something like this, whatever fits in, your area that you have in your garden. Let's talk about interplanting just a little bit. Now, using small spaces, you want to utilize all of the area that you have. So interplanting can be used to save space and to plant more. Generally, it matches a slow-growing large vegetable with a faster-growing smaller vegetable. And so the slow-growing large crop requires wide spacing between plants to accommodate its eventual size. And so it starts off small, you've got lots of area there. So by putting in small, fast-growing crops in those spaces between the larger plants, they'll mature before the larger plants shade them out, and you will have enjoyed all of those in the meantime. And as an example, think about those larger plants, cabbage, cauliflower, big leaves, broader areas. They need to be planted early in the season, but of course they won't start filling out for at least 6 weeks. So while they're small, you can sow quickly maturing vegetables like lettuce, spinach, beets, any of those that grow quickly and can be harvested in a relatively short period of time between them. And then, you just go out and harvest those little ones as you want to. And like I say, enjoy them before the big ones shade them out. Succession planting is a little different than interplanting, because succession planting includes several planting methods that increase crop availability during a growing season by making use of space and timing. So you can plant 2 or more crops in succession. So after one crop is harvested, another's planted in the same space. The length of the growing season, climate, and crop selection are key factors. For example, a cool season spring crop like spinach or something like that could then be followed by a heat-loving summer crop. And so you're really utilizing that space and everything by timing those different kinds of vegetables in their planting and harvesting. And then the same crop, successive plantings, if you have, a type of vegetable that will grow all season long, but is relatively quick to mature, then you can plant several small plantings at different timed intervals rather than all at once. So the plants then mature at different dates, and you have a continuous harvest over an extended period of time. Lettuce and other salad greens are common crops for this. So there's just lots of ways that you can utilize, a raised bed or, even some containers that we'll talk about to get more out of it during the entire growing season. Any questions, Ariel?
No questions. Really great comment from Casey Kim about using cheesecloth or old pantyhose as a sling just to keep those like cantaloupe and squash off the ground. So I thought that was a great point.
Oh, that is a great idea. That is a great idea. Yeah, good way to get rid of that old pantyhose that none of us wear anymore. Yes. All right, let's talk about container gardening. Container gardening can be really, really fun if you don't want to do a raised bed or in addition to your raised bed, because they can be located in flower beds, on your deck, any sunny location in your yard. And I love this blue pot, that big blue pot that has things growing, and it's pretty. And I'd love to go out every morning and look at that. So again, it gives me some ideas of using some space on my deck. But you can use a variety of shapes and sizes that suit your plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about container size as we go along. But the other thing is that tender plants in containers can be brought in during cold spells, or they're easier to cover up with an old sheet or something like that if we have a cold night. Containers can also be used to control invasive plants and like mint, but some of the other are also rather invasive. So planting them in containers is a good way to keep that control. Good vegetables for container gardening. Tomatoes. I think I'm going to plant a couple of tomatoes in containers this year. I've always planted them in my beds, and I did have a struggle with it last year because we did get some fungus in that. My bigger tomato plant was an early girl, which usually is really resistant, but it sort of got decimated later in the season. I also had a Sweet 100, the cherry tomato plant, and it did really, really well. It just produced its little heart out. But I think that to get more air around the tomato plants, I think I'm going to plant a couple of them in big containers and see how they do this year. Eggplant, and I love this picture of eggplant. I think eggplant is one of the most beautiful vegetables, and it just always makes me smile to go out and see an eggplant growing because of that beautiful color. I'm not sure they have much taste, but just growing them makes you feel happy. Peppers, squash, leaf lettuce, green onions, radishes, and again, herbs in containers are ones that are suggested. But you can sort of play around with them and try different things, different years, to see which really comes out to be the best option for you. Container pot size guidelines. You want to make sure that you have got a pot that's going to fit your vegetable. So, a gallon pot or less used for small vegetables, 1 to 3 gallon pot for larger vegetables like the smaller tomato plants, peppers and things like that. And then you want to use a good sized pot if you're growing full-size tomatoes or any of the vine crops. And I have to laugh because I looked at this picture of the spare of the old tires that I'm not quite sure what's growing in them, but I had to laugh about that because I guess you can use just about anything you want. The only thing I would say is something like that, it would be hard to fill with a good medium because it would take so much of it. But I guess you could put some regular soil down at the bottom and then fill the top part up with the good stuff. But didn't say it had to be pretty. All right, soil for container vegetables. The best soil mix for container grown vegetables is one that is well drained, well aerated, and has a pH that's close to neutral. If you can find something that looks like this in the picture that the person is holding, I mean, that's the good stuff. Soil containing or soil-less potting mixes offer all of these features. And again, you can buy some of the bag mixes that are strictly for containers. And so you want to be careful when you're, if you're buying the bagged stuff, that it is for the purpose intended. So, there's some stuff out there for raised beds, there's stuff out there for containers, but you want to look for mixes with vermiculite or perlite, and that helps aerate the soil and it also helps to retain moisture. Garden soil is not a good option for containers because in pots, the garden soil compacts and it leads to poor drainage and airflow within the soil. So it's really important that you have really good drainage and some airflow within those pots. the top of the soil may appear dry, but the soil a few inches down gets waterlogged. And so it prevents your plants from taking up nutrients. So I think you'll have to experiment a little bit about that with that, because there's so many different varieties out there. Some of them to retain water. And again, it may depend on the size of pot you have, and of course the vegetable and how tolerant they are to those kinds of things. So because potting mixes have been heated during processing, they're generally free of weed, seeds, pests, and disease. So that's the other real benefit of them in a container, because you don't want, any of those kinds of things to be in your container. So if you use garden soil, again, you may get some weed seeds or fungal spores or other pests that can be detrimental to your vegetable plants. So again, you have to read the label, make sure it fits what you're trying to use it for. Watering container gardens, no rule of thumb on how often to water. It's going to vary with the type of plant, the potting mix, the weather conditions, and the type of pot used. Some of the pots, will take some of the water away from your soil. Some of them will hold it much better. And again, your plant, what kind of plant you have, does it take a lot of water, or is it one that can do better with being a little bit drier? Again, the potting mix, is it made to retain water, or is it going to dry out more quickly? Daily watering may be needed during hot, dry periods, and we all know that when our summers hit and we don't get a little bit of rain. So you need to check your plants regularly and look for signs of wilting to indicate a need for water, or stick your finger in the upper inch or so of the potting mix to feel for dryness. And a lot of the time your plant's going to tell you whether it needs to be watered, because you can go out there and it's going to be gasping. And so you want to pay attention to it. And if you have to be away on vacation or something like that, why you want to make sure you have somebody that's going to check your plants regularly and knows a little bit about watering them, so they don't drown them or they don't let them dry out too much. So you want to apply a sufficient amount of water to allow a small amount to come out the bottom drain hole. And of course, you know that in any of these containers, you've got to have drain holes in the bottom. This indicates that the container, the soil or the mix, is thoroughly saturated with water. But potting mixes, because of their very lightness and their qualities for drainage and for getting air to your plant roots, they can be easily washed out of the container. So you want to water them gently. If you have a hose, it's probably better to put a watering wand on it so you can turn down to a gentle stream, or to use a good watering can. So fertilizing container gardens, because you water them more frequently, it washes the fertilizer out of the containers as you water. So a plant with a small constricted root system requires regular fertilizing. The easiest thing is to use the liquid fertilizers, but if you apply a dilute fertilizer solution, you want to apply it at every other watering, not every single watering. And then you want to use only 1/4 the recommended rate, unless the instructions give directions for continuous feeding for container gardening. So again, you need to really pay attention to the fertilizer that you're using and what is it saying on there, what is recommended, and really pay attention to that, because while the fertilizer does get washed out, you still don't want to over fertilize your plant. Alternatively, you can use controlled release or time release fertilizers. Those are the little pellets designed to release fertilizer gradually over a long period of time, and use these according to the directions on the package label. And again, I would caution you, when you're buying the medium that you're using in the container, be sure you read the label, because a lot of those that are made specifically for container gardens, they're going to have some of the time release fertilizer in them. And so you want to make sure that you read everything on that label and make sure that that's how you intend to use it, so you don't really over fertilize your plants. All right, any questions or comments, Ariel?
Just one about the tires in particular, the ugly option. But one point that was brought up is, cleanliness of using recycled materials. So I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in and say that it's always a good idea if you're using tires or another recycled plastic, a treated lumber, especially railroad ties and telephone poles, specifically for vegetable gardening, that we line them with a durable plastic, just because some of those chemicals actually have been shown to leach into specifically vegetable gardens. So they're suitable to use, but they do need to be lined with a plastic. But my personal view is that I think tires are ugly. But it can be nice to use things that you have, especially when we're looking at the more affordable options. So that was just a discussion that we were having in the chat box.
I think that whoever used these must have a really great sense of humor.
Yeah, it was a very interesting look.
Not something I want in my backyard, but who's to say? It's not, to each his own. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about location, as they say in real estate. And with all of the small gardens and with container gardens and, wherever you plant your vegetables, you've got to have lots of light, because most of the garden vegetables need at least 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day to grow. And particularly those fruiting vegetables like tomatoes. You all know how much sun tomatoes take. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, when I lived in Seattle, it was really hard to capture enough sun. And so, I put my raised bed in it at the foot of a fence that was where they could catch the south sun, and it was reflected off that fence. And, you needed every bit of it possible. But here, that's not quite as much of an issue, because we get lots of sunshine. But you just want to make sure before you plant your vegetables or develop your raised bed, that area, if you're going to plant tomatoes and things like that in it, that it gets at least 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day. Now, some of the other crops, if you're going to plant, other root crops like potatoes and leafy crops like lettuce and that, you really don't need to be as concerned about getting that much sun. But they all need sun. They all need, direct sun for them to grow and develop and be a good crop. So one thing with container gardening, if you find that you put your container someplace where you don't get an awful lot of sun, you can always move it around. So, you may want to try a few different things. But again, I caution you that if you're building a raised bed for the very first time, before you ever do that, you might want to, go out there and kind of mark off where you intend to dig down and build that raised bed, and then keep an eye on it to make sure that it gets enough sun before you ever go to all the work and everything to put it in. It's also important that your gardens are convenient to you. So, when my garden's growing, it's out there in the corner of my yard. I can see it from my deck, and I wander out there in the morning with my coffee cup to see what's going on and see if anything needs to be watered, or, if there's bugs out there and that. And so, it's really like, for those of us that like vegetable gardening, it's like planting flowers. You want to be able to see it. You want to be able to enjoy it. So, put it out there where you are seeing it every day, you're visiting it every day, and not someplace out away where you tend to get sidetracked and don't get out there to really keep an eye on it. And then you also need to consider this, the soil, air, and water drainage. Some of our wind, our winds can be pretty vicious. And then if you're on a slope, all of those kinds of things, so really take all of that into consideration before you put the time and energy into putting a garden. Or you might find that you plant different things from year to year. So again, don't put a permanent raised bed, build one that is more easily taken apart and you can move it around. So there's all different kinds. And you know, once you get used to doing some of the raised bed gardening and growing vegetables in small spaces, well, you learn more about, you know, your area and what really works for you, what location, where you want to see them and what you want to plant. So there's lots of options for you. Now, using soil temperature as a gauge when to start, you know, when do you plant some of these kinds of things? And so, you know, I laughed at this picture, but you know, that looks like what I would stick in a roast. And you can use the same type of thing, you know, to measure how warm the soil is. And so soil temperature should be stable, that in other words, consistent for several days. Cool season crops, the soil at 2 to 3 inch depth in late morning should be 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And you think of cool season crops being, you know, those cabbage, peas, onions, you know, the ones that can be planted when it's a little cooler, spinach, all of those. And then the warm season crops need at least 55 degrees soil temperature. And thinking about tomatoes, sweet corn, you may not think of sweet corn in a small garden like this, but peppers, any of those that are considered warmer season crops, you want the soil to be at least 55 degrees. And then those very warm season crops, you want the soil to be consistently at least 60 degrees. And that's when we're talking about, you know, probably more of the vining type of crops, squash, watermelons, cucumbers, cantaloupes, all of those kinds that are really our very warm season crops. So again, measure that at 2 to 3 inches into the soil during the late morning and take that temperature over a few days so it's consistently within those you know, degrees, 45, 55, 60, before you plant anything out there. Vegetable climate preferences. What are the ones that like, you know, the cool season? We think of lettuce, radishes, spinach, potatoes, onions, peas, carrots, cabbage, asparagus. So all of those are the ones that can be planted when it's cooler. And those are generally the ones too, you know, a few of them on the list are long maturing ones like potatoes and onions, but some of these other ones really do lend themselves to some of the types of gardening that we talked about, where you can interplant or you know, succession plant, because you can get these started, and by the time they mature, then you know, you can plant something else, or you've already got something else growing that may shade them out later. Then the warm season crops, and there's both warm and very warm season crops on here. Again, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, melons, sweet potatoes, pumpkin squash, eggplant, beans. And of course, you know, we know that some of those are, if they get frosted or get very cold, they're not going to do well at all. So then we can use mulches to change soil temperature and help increase the soil temperature or decrease the soil temperature. So looking at different kinds of mulch, and some of these we don't even think about really as a mulch, like the first one, clear plastic. If you put clear plastic over the soil, it's going to raise the temperature of the soil by about 10 degrees. Black plastic, you know, the sun doesn't go through it, but it still raises the temperature by about 6 degrees. And then conversely, you know, when it gets really hot and we want to retain some of the moisture in the soil and have the soil not get quite so hot, you know, people will use things like newspapers and that to decrease the soil temperature by about 7 degrees. And then, of course, organic mulches are the ones we most often think of as mulch, that we're putting around our plants and can lower that soil temperature by about 10 degrees. All right, that is all I have. Do we have any more questions?
The one thing that I will go ahead and talk about now as everybody kind of prepares to unmute, and you guys are welcome to keep using the chat box or to just engage in a discussion, was a question about drip irrigation. And so I just wanted to mention that at the end of this seminar, I will be sending out a really short quiz, not really a quiz, post survey that I'm hoping that you'll all fill out just to help us improve. I will also send out a link to our website that has a lot of really great vegetable gardening resources, and our drip irrigation publication is on that website. So that's going to go out in an email afterwards, along with eventually the recording when Zoom makes that available to me, and a copy of the slides. So that was a couple questions that we had. And then I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in with some questions for Becky after her great presentation. And Becky, you might stop your screen sharing.
Okay, before I do though,
Yes.
I want to just remind everyone that even though we are not physically in the extension office answering the response line as master gardeners, which we usually are, Ariel's going to be manning the response line, and it's going to be open April 1st through September 30th. But it's going to be a virtual response line only. So the number to call is 785-232-0062, extension 104, or email Ariel at arielw@ksu.edu with your questions. And she is going to respond to those questions that you have. And the master gardeners, if we get a lot of questions, we volunteered to help her do research, because all of our answers are research-based. And then the other thing that I wanted to just remind you is that the Kansas Garden Guide that's published by K-State Research and Extension is a wonderful, wonderful publication. It has got so much information in there that is specific to Kansas. And so it is a freebie. You can go in and download a copy of it at this website that I've listed on there. So I would suggest that all of you go in and download that. And of course it's updated, periodically. So it is just great, great information.
And I'll have that on the website I send out to. Becky's right. That's one of our best vegetable gardening publications. To kick off our questions, we had one in the chat box from Kathleen about reusing medium from year to year if you fertilize and remix.
What I do in mine, again, I don't make my own medium. I buy the bagged stuff. And so I leave mine in the bed from year to year, but of course it tends to settle down and all that. And so in the spring, I may take some of that out. And particularly like last year, where I had an issue with some of the fungus and things like that on tomatoes, it concerns me a little bit that, some of that may still be in the soil. So I'm going to take some of that out and move it someplace else where it wouldn't be an issue. And then I add new to mine every year. I'll add, a few bags of mine and dig it in so that I've got some new soil. And the medium that I use happens to have fertilizer in it. And so I'm not going to add any extra fertilizer at the beginning. So it's going to kind of depend on what you're using. If you're using a medium that you prepare yourself, it's probably not going to have that fertilizer in it. You can go ahead and mix it in with, what you used the year before. But I would also then mix in the 10-10-10 fertilizer in there. Does that answer it?
Any other questions?
Becky, I was wondering if you had a tried and true tomato variety that you like to grow in pots. Diane had said, I think Better Bush, she liked in a pot. Do you prefer any?
Well, my sort of go-to, I tend to like the smaller tomatoes. I'm not a beefsteak tomato person. I like the smaller ones. And so I have kind of gone with early girl, celebrity, and they don't get very big, but they're ideal little slicing tomatoes, and I can just go out and eat one if I want to. And so I have found that those are pretty disease resistant, and they don't get huge. The plants get good size, but they don't get huge like some of the other ones do. And then, of course, last year and the last couple of years for cherry tomatoes, I put in that Sweet 100. And I love those because the bush, it lends itself to a container. I didn't put it in a container last year. I'm going to this year. But it produced just hundreds and hundreds of cherry tomatoes. I just go out there and just eat them. So that's what I found. Now, it kind of depends on, you know, what your preference is. If you like those bigger, you know, beefsteak tomatoes, some of those plants may get really, really big, so they may not lend themselves to container gardening. They may be better off, you know, where you can really put some support around them in a raised bed.
We've got one more question in the chat box from Connie about, will we be able to buy tomato plants that are being grown in the Master Gardener greenhouse? Unfortunately, we just don't have an answer for that. We are still being told by K-State, and there's a couple of you on here that are Master Gardeners in other counties too, so you're probably experiencing similar things. And I know Wyandotte, I think, has figured out what they're going to do. But May 16th is our date, and we just don't have any answers for what we're going to do. What we're not going to do is throw the plants away. We're going to figure something out. But every day, every week, this is changing, and we would really love to be able to get those vegetables in particular in the hands of people that need them. But we're still trying to figure it out. But good question, Connie.
Anything else? Well, I want to personally say thank you for attending today. You know, I think these webinars are a good way to get information out there. You know, we love doing the library presentations, but of course we're not able to do that right now. And so, you know, Zoom has got a great product out there to allow us to, you know, share ideas and share education and everything. So thank you again for tuning in today, and hopefully we'll have some other great presentations as we go along.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Becky.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Becky. I really enjoyed it. It was good.
Great.
Very nice. Very good.
Yeah, me
Good job,
too.
Becky.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.